It would be ironic if modern scientists projected as much onto nature as prehistoric animists did, when the latter interpreted natural events as happening because of the influence of ancestral spirits, gods, or a divine plan. After all, scientists have the benefit of hindsight, and have developed their institutions and methods to avoid flagrant personifications and other mental projections onto nature. Scientists gather data and test their explanations with great rigor, which results in much of the progress that developed societies take for granted. Surely, scientific theories are far more objective than religious myths, and indeed they are. Contrary to some half-baked, postmodern sociology, science isn't just a religion, and scientific theories aren't theologies or myths. Those are obvious category errors. Yet the success of science invites us to envision pure objectivity or absolute knowledge. We imagine we might arrive at a theory of nature that includes no trace of human intuition, so that the theory can do justice to nature's generality that extends far beyond our parochial preoccupations. From a pragmatic neo-Kantian standpoint, that vision is flawed. There is no understanding of anything, including nature, without some dubious mental projection or humanization. Now, scientific theories are stripped of all the obvious humanizations, such as the dramatic narratives you find in religious myths. Indeed, the hard scientists avoid even natural languages, preferring mathematics to distance themselves as fully as possible from the connoted metaphors that natural languages would introduce. Yet math generally tracks quantities, and you can chart some terrain without understanding what you've charted. Equations, for instance, lay out relations between variables, using the concept of equality to organize them. Moreover, scientists observe regularities, and that perceived order provides the impetus for rational explanations. Still, there's some potential for confusion in this scientific talk of natural relations, correlations, or relationships. Think of structural realism, the view that what makes a scientific theory true is that its structure, rather than its content, can correspond to some real patterns in nature. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia article on the subject, this view derives from John Worrell's landmark 1989 article in which he argued that structural realism navigates a Scylla and Charybdis. On the one hand, science's progress would be miraculous if scientific theories weren't somehow objectively true. On the other, we ought to perform a pessimistic meta-induction. Since all the past scientific theories have been surpassed, we should expect the same to happen to all present and future ones. Worrell argued that what's surpassed is the content of scientific theories, the way the theorists purport to understand nature with certain intuitive metaphors. But what isn't surpassed is the theory's structure, as in the mathematical generalizations that may only be differently characterized in different cultures or periods. Thus, Worrell says, the structural realist simply asserts, in other words, that, in view of the theory's enormous empirical success, the structure of the universe is probably something like quantum mechanical. Similarly, following Poincaré, Worrell says, Poincaré is claiming that, although from the point of view of Maxwell's theory, Fresnel entirely misidentified the nature of light, his theory accurately described not just light's observable effects but its structure. Again, on the structural realist view, what Newton really discovered are the relationships between phenomena expressed in the mathematical equations of his theory, the theoretical terms of which should be understood as genuine primitives. My problem with structural realism is that it's realistic about structures, relations, correlations, and relationships, since those concepts are too intuitive to apply to nature at large. The view that nature has a structure is practically Platonic, which would entail a teleological view of natural patterns or forms. Relations hold substantively between socially oriented organisms, as in the case of family relations, and only derivatively between anything else. At the bottom of correlations is the idea of correspondence, which is a kind of agreement that, likewise, if taken literally, would imply a teleological view of nature, as though natural patterns were supposed to occur according to a divine plan. Relationships are also primarily social affairs, not natural ones. Just as animists freely projected human characteristics onto nature, structural realists do so by insisting that nature has a structure that corresponds to scientific theories. The primary sense of structure is that of construction, as in the act of building. Now, nature does appear to build itself, resulting in various physical constructs. But when we think of natural complexification and evolution as resulting in structures, consisting of related parts or relationships between types, we're in danger of humanizing nature in a neo-animistic manner. In that case, we'd fail to appreciate the upshot of scientific naturalism, which is that nature's productivity is mindless and thus devoid of all but aesthetic values. At any rate, we shouldn't lose sight of the likelihood that what's primarily related in scientific theories are symbols and concepts, not natural things in themselves. What has normative structure is the theory insofar as it satisfies some principles of critical thought and scientific method, or the main structure at issue in science is the technological one we seek to impose on nature's wildness with the aid of scientific understanding.
I am with you until you say that those concepts, structures, relations, correlations, and relationships are too intuitive to apply to nature at large. You want to claim that relations only truly hold between social organisms, and any other usage, for example to describe a correlation between the spin of photons, is derivative. But here you are merely falling into a category mistake yourself by conflating the etymology of the word relation with its technical or mathematical meaning when deployed in something like structural realism or relational quantum mechanics. I've made this point to you repeatedly before, and you just continue to reiterate the danger that such terms might confuse us and either be the symptom or the cause of an anthropomorphic projection onto impersonal nature. You have never, as far as I recall, addressed the objection head-on. All linguistic terms have a history and thus the potential for some semantic contamination when repurposed, but this possibility does not invalidate the use of the word when suitably qualified. In fact, if you were to ask nearly any physicist, cosmologist, or structural realist, they would agree that nature's productivity is mindless and thus devoid of values. Doesn't this fact suggest that they have avoided the lurking linguistic fallacy? Although I'm not quite a structural realist, I would argue that as far as philosophies of science go, its emphasis on structure and relation represents an attempt to minimize precisely the kind of interpretative or metaphysical overlay that you object to. Relation has a social meaning, but it also has a totally distinct abstract meaning that derives etymologically from the social one, but has come to signify something completely impersonal, a link or a correspondence between measured values. But with those terms, of course, new hazards arise to keep you awake at night. A link might connote an actual physical connection that might not be there. A correspondence might imply the exchange of messages. Language is a minefield. Perhaps we should resort to a neologism and use the word irks instead of relations in order to avoid the perils of projection. Or we could ban correlation and only talk about Pearson coefficients. Perhaps we should not talk about mathematical functions, though, because the term once referred to a person's role in society. Surely it would be more sensible to embrace the language we have while sidestepping any potential etymological confusions. Surely it would be more sensible to embrace the language we have while sidestepping any potential etymological confusions. The world is, in fact, structured, although not, thank you for reminding us, constructed. There is, in fact, order as well as disorder. Otherwise, the concept of entropy would have no meaning, and we would not be here to debate this subject. There is even a lot of relationship in the social sense. There are correlations between the structure of your DNA and that of the mildew in your shower, because you are literally distant relations. The carbon you are mainly made of is related to the points of light you see in the night sky. And we know this because scientists undertook to understand the structure of the world and the relations that pertain within it. In fact, biological and social relations derive from more general abstract physical and mathematical relations that science attempts to describe, rather than the other way around. Of course, you understand this. You just want to remind us, again and again, of our etymological peril in using language at all to describe this situation. Finally, you remind us that what's primarily related in scientific theories are symbols and concepts, not natural things in themselves. That is true, but misleading. Of course, scientific theories are abstract constructs in the minds of scientists, and thus the relations they describe exist primarily, as you say, in those abstractions. But they do not only exist in the theories, otherwise these abstractions would not be so damn hard to come by, and so effective in predicting the actual behavior of the world.
You're responding to the semantic issue by pointing out that scientists can just redefine these words to suit their deeply informed view of nature. And indeed, in an upcoming article on the laws of nature, I point out that the fact that scientists are disproportionately atheistic shows that scientists are hardly fooled by the social connotations of some of their key terms. But the semantic issue is a sideshow. What I'm interested in is how scientists understand nature, once we dispense with the questionable connotations and insinuations. What is the meaning of nature's structure, given atheistic naturalism? What does it mean for natural events to be non-socially related, correlated, or ordered? What are non-social relationships in a strictly scientific objective sense? This is easier to understand in the context of biology, where functions, constructs, and purposes play an obvious role, but life is anomalous in nature, so biology is a special case. What I'm driving at is the underlying metaphysical picture of pantheism that scientific explanations of nature's productivity entail. There are two interpretations of the talk of natural relations, a naive anthropocentric kind and a more enlightened pantheistic kind that's consistent with atheistic naturalism. The naive interpretation is a cover-up. We project reassuring social concepts onto nature in a neo-animistic move. This projection is a prelude to our civilized projects of terraforming, as we pave the way for our technology's physical imposition of human purposes onto nature with imaginary domestications. The more enlightened interpretation recognizes an independent, alienating productivity, one that's mindlessly and thus inhumanly prevalent in all strictly physical interactions. The two interpretations thus correspond to mainstream cultures and the counterculture, and the latter's insights are often kept hidden because they're unsettling or subversive. Now, if biology derives from an abstract mathematical sense of order, as you suggest, that could still be consistent with a mainstream construal of pantheism, according to which nature is a giant organism that unfolds according to a plan or Platonic niche. This would be ancient Greek pantheism that entailed a teleological view of natural kinds and processes. So there are two issues on the table, the semantic and conceptual ones. Regarding the semantic one, I'd ask for the scientific definition of natural relation, and I'd inspect the definition to see if it makes sense even when it doesn't presuppose anything unscientific. Certainly I wouldn't take scientists' word for it when they say they know what they're talking about. Obviously science works, but that doesn't mean scientists care about the ultimate meaning of their words. Conceptual analysis is a philosophical task, and most scientists are too busy to think philosophically. Regarding the conceptual issue, the question is whether the talk of natural relations entails an unsettling bit of pantheistic metaphysics, and whether we can understand nature's self-creativity without resorting to teleology. In other words, the question is whether scientists are inclined to flee the cosmicist upshot of their conceptions of nature. As for whether there are only natural structures rather than constructs, I think the difference would depend precisely on whether science has eliminated teleology in physics. The universe builds stars and planets, presumably to serve no purpose. Hence, there are no natural constructs in the human-centered social sense. What then is the inhuman sense of nature's productive structure? What is anti-teleological pantheism? The answer to that question takes us to cosmicism and existentialism.
Earlier, you did call into question structural realism on the basis that structures, relations, correlations, and relationships are too intuitive to apply to nature at large, and that, for some reason, correlation or correspondence would imply a teleological view of nature. So in saying that this is all actually a sideshow, I sense a little rhetorical slippage here. Still, I'll take it then that you accept that scientists do not fall prey to the questionable connotations and insinuations that concern you, and that therefore you'll allow me to use words like relation without further justification.